Okay, good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock. It's Friday, the 20th of March, which means it's finally time to get started with today's webinar. The topic of today, as you know, is how to replace a live event with a successful webinar. And with us for that purpose, we have our CEO, Jacob Löwenbrand, who has spent the last hour adding, I think, 10 new slides to this presentation. Good morning, Jacob. Are you with us?
Hi there, Richard.
Good morning. Would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, so my name is Jacob Löwenbrand. I'm the Managing Director of Bright Vision. And yeah, looking forward to spend 30 minutes with you here today.
Yeah, so do I. And so you know, my name is Ricard Hirfalk. I work as Head of Sales here at Bright Vision, and hopefully I will also be able to bring some good ideas to the table. Jacob and I, we're both in the office today, but in different conference rooms, trying to follow the best practice on social distancing. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why we set up this webinar with such short notice. So why don't you tell us a bit more about that, Jacob?
Yeah, so why do we have this webinar? We're, as many other companies, of course, impacted by the Corona crisis. And it's something that has forced us, as well as many of our clients, to think our live event strategies and see how we can produce content instead, because we can't stop, we can't just put down everything we do and so forth. Instead, I think it's very important that companies continue to do as much business as usual as possible. So since we have been doing webinars almost for 10 years now, we started out in 2011 doing our first webinar series here at Bright Vision, and over the years we have produced both for ourselves and for clients well over 200 webinars. So I hope we have some experiences and some short tips and tricks that we share with you here today. And also, a lot of people are thinking about how to pivot a live event to some kind of digital or online event or webinar. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, and hopefully you can get some practical advices and some maybe one or two ideas with you that might be helpful. That's our goal for today, at least. And yeah, and speaking about webinars, I mean, webinars is great as a complement to live events in a normal case as well, even though it has its limitations. But as of now, it's online events that's the only way to go forward for a foreseeable future. So right now, I think it's important for every content-driven marketing organization to actually get a good webinar or online event strategy in place quite quickly. And it has a lot of webinar has a lot of benefits, as we have preached over the years. It's costing less. You can do it with a shorter planning time. Actually, we decided to do this webinar only last Friday, so a week ago, and we sent out the invitations in social and email on Tuesday this week. So yeah, that's pretty short for an event. It's harder to do those kind of short planning periods for live events, of course. So it has its obvious benefits from these kind of things. Another big and often overseen benefit of online events and webinars is that it creates good on-demand content that we can put up on a landing page, gated or not gated. But yeah, it fills up our resource library with recorded webinars for maybe persons that might find out of this event later. Obvious drawbacks is, of course, no networking. I would love to meet everybody in person as we do at live events, shaking hands and so forth. But yeah, that's probably not doable now for a while. And also, it's a shorter time attention span on webinar and digital events. It's much harder to keep the focus on a screen. So for full day events and so forth, we would recommend to short it down, try to find it in more small bits and pieces. So moving on from there, Richard.
Yeah, before the webinar, so a few ideas on what to consider, mainly about how to drive registration. So if we look at the next slide, Jacob, you want to start out fairly early, not perhaps as early as you would for a live event, but I think 5 weeks is a good sweet spot for a webinar, because it gives you a couple of weeks to kind of narrow down what you want to talk about. You get time to prepare your landing page for registrations. You get time to prepare your information email going out to people on it. So when you have about 3 weeks left before the webinar, that's a good time to start actively invite people to the event. So again, if we move on here, we have a few different sources that we usually utilize at Bright Vision, at least for this. So for one thing, we use our database, our opted in clients and prospects, to kind of get a good foundation of registrations. Most people will come from that. So if you haven't already, start build your database for several reasons. One of them being your webinar invitations. And to bring in some additional new people, new prospects, we utilize mainly LinkedIn, sometimes Facebook, but mainly LinkedIn, where we use both paid ads that we push towards certain roles at certain industries. We usually see between $20 and $100 per registration, depending on the topic. So if that's the cost you're willing to take, that's a good thing to utilize. And we combine that, of course, with organic social selling in a way. Usually we set up a 10-15 second video that we either put up from the speaker's LinkedIn account or from our company page, and then we have as many employees as possible share it with their connections, so we get a good spread on it. Sometimes we've also helped clients do a telemarketing push for a webinar, but my recommendation there is it can become a bit too expensive if you only use it to drive to a webinar. So it's good if you combine it so that you have appointment setting in calls with prospects who are really interested in this topic. And for those who are interested but more on a mid or long term, you tell them that you have a webinar on the same topic and register them to that. So kind of a good thing to bring to an appointment setting campaign, but not something on its own. So just a few tools on how to bring in attendees for an event.
Thank you, Richard. Another really important part of setting up a webinar or online event is to have a good platform to host it on. I think this is a basic question, but it still needs to be addressed since there are so many providers out there. As you know, this webinar is set up on Citrix GoToWebinar platform, which we actually been using for over 10 years now since we started out. And it have evolved over the years, and it's a very stable platform we can definitely recommend. But we've also used many other platforms over the years. The recent years we have been using WebEx and Zoom as complements for different things. I think Zoom is a really good platform if you want to have more kind of roundtables or interactive events where everybody is supposed to joining in and speaking and so forth. For more of one-to-many communication like we're doing now, I think the more traditional GoToWebinar platforms, GoToWebinar and WebEx, are probably to prefer since they have more of that kind of setup built in and so forth. You also have more automation built in a GoToWebinar and WebEx. For example, email support for sending out stuff, introduction landing pages and so on. And there's also many specialist webinar platforms that have similar things and features built in. You can also actually host the webinar in Microsoft Teams if you want to, but then it's more of a manual setup. You need to invite everybody and so on, but it's still doable. So there's many ways you can choose this from. If you haven't choose the platform and want to dig out more into this, I can recommend to go to G2 Grid for their software category webinar. Here you can find about 25 different suppliers of platforms for webinars. And as you probably know, you get the link in the presentation afterwards. But here you can find all of the pros and cons with the different vendors in this area, so you can choose. If you have more of a complex need, maybe you have a full day event and want to do something more than just a webinar session for an hour or two or so, maybe you want to look into the more advanced platforms that's around as well, which is more of a virtual event platforms. There's quite a few providers in this space as well. For example, INXPO, that offers more of a virtual similar style of conference or industrial fair, where you both have demand center where you can have both live and streaming content as well as on-demand content. You can have networking with chat rooms where you can enter, as well as help desks and exhibition halls. Those are a bit more complex to set up, of course, but that's definitely something we're going to see more of. Okay, let's talk about what's going on during the webinar, Richard.
Yeah, let's do that.
So now we're going to talk about what we think are things to think about when setting up and presenting. A bit pressure now, since we're talking about how to do webinars here. A question: when you have, of course, decided your content and so on, we all know that you're the experts of your own content, so we won't go into what content to choose and so on, but rather how to present your content. And a question every company that wants to set up an online event today needs to ask is, do we want to do the traditional one with slides and presenting as we do now, or should we just go live and sit and chit chat and have more of a discussion podcast style, which is also quite popular? Our take on that is it's good whichever you do, but if you go with slides, we have a few ideas what we think is good to think about and so forth. So we have chosen to go with slides today, since we have more of here's a few points to remember and so on. But we could also have done this more like a Q&A, sitting, talking to each other and so on.
Yeah.
To get a good start.
Yeah, no matter if you want to utilize a slide deck or just speak to the camera, getting a good start is key. For one thing, one actually quite big difference to a live event is that you will have a large group of people, registrations, who join in a bit late. People who come from one meeting straight into your webinar. If they haven't used your webinar client before, they might need to download something. They need to find their headset. They need everything set up. So no matter what you do, on your side, you're gonna have people join in 2-3 minutes late, and you need to prepare for that. You should start out on time, of course, to respect those that are on time. But if you have some form of story or something that you want to tell, you perhaps should not start with it out of the gate. Wait a couple of minutes and rather begin with presenting yourself, presenting your company. You might talk a bit about what's going to happen today. How long is your webinar? Is there going to be a Q&A afterwards? Will you send out the recording in the end, and so on, just so that you get people a chance to join in after grabbing their coffee or whatever they've been doing. So that's one thing to consider and remember when you get started with webinars, if you've done a lot of live events before, when you have people sitting around already. In addition, it might take a couple of minutes to get the flow of things if you're speaking in a webinar. So what I like to do is to basically write down almost word for word what I want to say in the beginning. I might not use it, but it's good to have that fallback if you get a bit tongue-tied as soon as you click that dreaded start recording button. So just a few things to remember to get as good of a start as possible, because that really shows if your whole webinar is going to be good or bad, how good or bad your start is.
Definitely. And one thing, when you get to webinars, it's good to know that you have the right tech setup. A few things we're thinking about is to try to use good microphones. In my case, I'm using a Snowball microphone here, which is it's not hi-fi quality, but it's still quite good quality for podcasting and webinars. We try to use video showing our persons in complement to the slides, as you see, and we try to think about having a good setup there around those things, so we don't miss out on video and sound quality. Therefore, I think it's important to not use telephone when calling in and presenting, for example, which unfortunately still occurs sometimes, and so forth. And also, I think we should address the stability of the of the lines you're sitting at.
Like my Wi-Fi.
Yeah. Make sure you have a good connection when you're doing the webinar. Okay, moving on there.
Yeah, how to be dynamic. You have some limitations in a webinar that you don't see on a stage. If you're on a stage, you can use your full body to express yourself. You can walk around. You can use the full stage to make your presentation dynamic. And you also have, of course, the option of looking at your audience and kind of see how engaged they are. If they are looking down on their phones, or if they are looking up at you, really listening to whatever you're saying. You don't have that possibility on a webinar. You can only see the attendee number and nothing else. But a few things to keep in mind, some that we've already covered, like using video, for example, so that people at least can see you even if you cannot see them. And using two speakers, so you don't have one person monologuing for half an hour or 45 minutes, might become a bit too boring. Something else you can do, talking about what you mentioned before about whether to use a slide deck or not. If we turn off the presentation for a second, Jacob, even if you use a slide deck, you can once in a while turn it off and just speak straight into the camera, because that change that happens on the screen, it makes attendees sit up a bit straight again if they started to zone out a bit after a few minutes. So just getting this difference and speaking directly to someone might get them to remember that specific talking point a bit better than whatever you covered just before that or just after that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be just using video rather than your presentation. It could also be that if you want to show something, a statistic or a picture or something that you found online, you don't need to just put it into your presentation. You can minimize it. You can open your browser, you can type in the website and scroll down. It gets a bit more engaging when there are things happening on the screen rather than just slide after slide. So that's just some ideas on how to be a bit more dynamic, a bit more interactive in a webinar as you would on a stage.
Yeah, good idea there, Richard. And
yes.
Here we come to a few ideas we have around content. It's always a hard thing around short content in webinars, how to balance between being too general and too specific. But I think it's a good idea to try to use examples as much as possible and not only present overall ideas or themes or so. So you exemplify as much as possible in order to make it more applicable for the listeners. Also, as we've been into, we prefer to use many slides through a webinar, and that's what we typically recommend the companies we coach around webinars. There are studies around the attention span for online events and so forth, and a lot of people actually zoom out after 60 seconds or more on the same slide. So in order to don't bore out the audience, we recommend to have quite a few slides so we don't stay too long on each slide. So 60 seconds is probably a good thing to go after there. And that also means that we can't have too much on a slide. It's need to be one thought or one idea per slide, so we don't have too complex slides with a lot of graphs or things. So if you have a graph, just have one graph there. If you have a few things to remember, try to keep them as few as possible, rather using more slides instead. So you can have one takeaway or one idea per slide instead. Also, if you want to keep the audience not too distracted, try to use good images and visualize what you're going to say, and try to find some kind of design for the presentation that actually keeps it a bit alive and so forth. We have had quite good experience from that over the past years. So we always put in a little bit of effort to put in pictures and visuals in order to support the messages.
You want to give an example by showing someone throwing a dog, Jacob?
Yeah, I think that's a good image.
It is.
Being a dog. Okay, another thing is how to be interactive. Our experiences around quizzes. We have tried quizzes both in live and online events, of course, and with a mixture of success. it's always, when using GoToWebinar, for example, it's always a little bit of a hassle to use the different built-in functions like polls and surveys, because I would recommend you have somebody with you who only will make sure you get that webinar to that poll to work, so you don't end up in clicking around and losing speed in your presentation and so forth. It's something that happens quite a lot when using those features, so just make sure you rehearse them. Sometimes we also used offline or on other like Kahoot surveys or polls in other systems that could be a bit more interactive than the built-in functionalities. But then you need more time in order to get it to do well. But interactivity is good, especially if you can have more of a discussion around it afterwards as well, and following up on the polls or questions you're putting out there, maybe letting people talk in the webinar and so forth. So that was a few ideas around the presentation and what to think about when presenting the content. But webinars are so much more. They're not only presenting it, they can be a really good source to get leads and send out contents afterwards and so forth. So I'm going to address that a bit, what to do in order to make the most of the content you have produced and now set up for a webinar. So Richard, what we do after the webinar?
Many things you can do, and this is something that people should be more active with. I see many companies that spend a lot of time getting registrations to the webinar. They put a lot of time into making it a really good presentation, but then afterwards nothing really happens, and marketing tells sales reps to follow up on these leads, but no one does that. So you need a process in place that starts already when preparing the webinar 5 weeks in advance, as I mentioned before. So for one thing, you should describe in invitations that everyone should register, even if they cannot attend, because they will get a recording, both if they show up or not, so that they can look at it afterwards, they can share it around. If you have a landing page where you have registrations, use the same landing page to put up an on-demand version of the webinar. And after a couple of months, you can even consider making it ungated, so you can start to get some more views on it, because after a while, the on-demand registrations for it will start to drop out. You can easily convert the webinar as well, like we've done with this one. We will post basically the same content as an article on our website and on LinkedIn, so that we use the same time spent on preparing this webinar to also have other forms of content for those that might not want to sit in for a webinar for 30 minutes, but rather to read through an article for 10 minutes. And of course, also make sure to see who you should follow up with. If you have many registrations, if you have 100 people joining in, it might be hard to follow up with all of them by connecting on LinkedIn or writing them an email or even calling them. But spend some time to look at who has been the most active in the webinar, who has an interesting role at a relevant company that you might want to get a connection with, or is there any company where you have had 10 people who've registered for this? There seems to be something happening at that company that makes this a relevant topic for them. So with today's analytics in GoToWebinar and in other platforms, you can really get a lot of insights that you can't really get from an event where you do more relationship building, but with a webinar and those analytics, you can get a good level of relationship building as well with key prospects that have registered to the event, who might not even have shown up, but just registered.
Absolutely. And that's a good idea, and brings us both more to the sales and marketing alignment, which is also the key part to get the most out of a webinar. When we help clients produce webinars as part of a campaign, maybe a digital campaign, we also recommend them to try to make as much information as possible around a webinar to the sales team, and especially the inside sales team, if they have the SDR team, so forth, or so they can use this content in different ways in following up. First of all, inviting people and having pre-written email send out cadences they can easily use when following up on them. But in order to be able to do that, they need to know which persona is this webinar targeting, what's the key messages, and what kind of questions are we addressing, and in what kind of buyer journey stage are those questions primarily addressed. So if you do that, you will definitely get more help from the sales team when setting up and doing this, and especially the follow-up afterwards is also going to be a bit more efficient, since there are a lot of things that we can work with coming from a webinar. If you go through the different lead categories after webinar, we have all the ones who have registered, of course. We have the ones who have attended and the ones who registered but didn't attend, of course. And also, if you have a marketing automation system, as we do, we also can see if there's a lot of activity going on that will reach our threshold for an SQL, a sales qualified lead, which defines, of course, a bit different, but somebody who shows a lot of interest and that needs inside sales follow-up or senior sales follow-up, and due to their online behavior. So I think those are important to work tightly together, both before and especially afterwards with the inside sales team, so you get the most of the leads. Okay, Richard, any comment on that?
Sounds good. Sounds
Yeah.
good, sir.
Okay, I see that we're getting to the end of the presentation and we have still a few minutes left, which takes us to a Q&A. So if you have a question, please write it into the question box in the GoToWebinar panel.
We have a few questions already, Jacob. I figured we could start going through them while people ask additional questions if they have any.
Yeah.
We have a couple of people who've asked about getting a recording afterwards, and yes, as you might have heard here, and we will send out recordings to everyone. I think they are scheduled to go out tomorrow sometime, so you will get those. Also, one question here: if you could give examples on follow-up content to nurture the leads from a webinar. One thing you could do is to offer something of value. I did a webinar recently on social selling, and something I offered in my email afterwards that got at least 10-15 responses or requests was that I was happy to provide feedback on the attendees' LinkedIn profile pages on what to improve on it. So you could always find some content or some support that relates to the topic of your webinar. Do you have any additional input on that question, Jacob? Examples of follow-up content to nurture the leads from a webinar?
Yeah, I think it's, as we have stated, it's important to have a follow-up cadence or ID what to provide in terms of content and try to provide value. So yeah, I think that exemplifies quite well what we try to do. For example, after this one, we can probably offer some kind of free advice or free consultation around webinar setups or giving feedback on webinar topics and so on, which we often freely would be glad to do for anybody reaching out. So try to provide something of value that you think would be quite accessible and not too much of a hassle for the audience to use. I think that's a good follow-up strategy.
Yes, one fallback option for content to share afterwards would be if you transform the webinar, as I mentioned, into an article in written text. That's an obvious thing to share with people, of course. Yeah. Here's another interesting question that I suppose is topical right now. Any ideas on how to recruit audience if you convert a third-party event to your own webinar, not having a participation list?
Yeah, that's a tough one. maybe you can. I have no idea more than you need to do the targeting, the online targeting campaign really targeted to that kind of industry or so. There are no quick answers to that. Maybe you can discuss since I mean, what all the arrangers of events and fairs are struggling with now is that they don't have any income streams anymore. So I would discuss with the specific event company having that kind of event and see, can we do a co-marketing campaign to that audience base and pay them for that, since they were probably happy to discuss whatever they can earn some money on today, since it's a really stressful situation when they have to cancel all their planned events for the foreseeable future. So I think that's the best shot you got there.
Yeah, speak with them, because it should be in their interest as well to make sure that everything is handled in the best possible way, considering the circumstances.
Yeah.
So great answer. Let's see if we get any more comments here. Great webinar, gotta go. Have a nice weekend. You too. Not a question though. I think we are fresh out, and we are also fresh out of time, I suppose. 10:31.
Yeah, I suppose so. And yeah, as a last comment there, I just would like to say that my worst webinar memory is when we had a webinar 2 years ago where we had an American speaker talking about video marketing, and he was sitting on a hotel Wi-Fi in Chicago presenting videos, which totally did not work. Just urge everybody not to do that mistake again. If you have content that is heavy and so forth, make sure you have good connections and sitting in a strong Wi-Fi or fixed connection. So
yeah,
you don't have to be embarrassed like I was.
You should consider the format of what you're going to show, and also where people are, as you mentioned with this American. Americans are also more keen to want to phone in to a webinar, right? Rather than just use the built-in audio functions on a computer. So if you have an international audience, consider also adding telephone numbers. Most platforms support that, so you can have telephones for people to call into if they want to do it the more old school way. And yeah, if you have more questions that might come up afterwards, we're more than happy to answer them afterwards. If you write us an email or something, you will have our contact details in the emails that go out tomorrow with the recording.
Absolutely, we're happy to continue asking answering questions. So just let us know if you have more questions around this. You know where to find us, and me and Richard try to be as helpful as possible. So I think it's good that everybody pulls together now and make sure that we all come online with our content and our events, and that is probably the best thing for the whole business community to do as of this situation right now. So with that said, I think it's thank you so much for your time today. It was an honor to have you with us, and I hope you get one or two ideas with you that maybe can get you on your way to set up a webinar series or something similar if you haven't done that before. So thank you so much, and reach out to us if you have more questions. We'll be happy to answer.
Yes, and have a nice Friday. Have a nice weekend, everyone.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.